Chapter 24, August 1987, New York. Part 1. Zoe arrived in New York on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. 14 months after the Chernobyl disaster, the Minister of Nuclear Industry had finally approved the 12-member delegation. For most of them, this was their first trip overseas. The group stared in awe at the city's hustle and bustle with equal parts excitement and trepidation ahead of their meeting with IAEA experts at the United Nations Plaza. Coming from a country where technology and development were still stuck 30 years in the past, they looked like schoolchildren on a trip to Disneyland, trying not to miss anything in one of the most modern cities on the globe. When she stepped out of the elevator the next morning, most of her colleagues were already in the hotel lobby. In addition to her considerable technical expertise, Zoe would also be putting her excellent English to use as the delegation's interpreter. The group milled around the space, too anxious about their task to sit down on the comfortable leather sofas. The Assistant Minister of Nuclear Industry looked at Zoe with a frown, taking in her beige skirt suit instead of the government standard navy suit. She wasn't surprised. He was the typical party leader, stiff, hypocritical, obsessed with protocol, and suspicious of any display of individuality. She met his disapproving eyes with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. Shin." He gave a curt nod and turned to address the rest of the delegation. "Here's our bus. Let's go." The bus crept out of Times Square toward the East River and the United Nations headquarters. Their guide, a young man on staff with the Chinese government at the UN, pointed out sights along 42nd Street. From the bizarre opulence of Grand Central Terminal to the Art Deco Chrysler Building and gleaming postmodern skyscrapers, the city flaunted its rich and varied architecture. Even Zoe was amazed by how much this great city had reinvigorated itself since her last visit in 1944. The bus dropped the delegation off at the main gate to the United Nations headquarters. No structure in China could even come close to the stunning complex. The unadorned concrete curve of the General Assembly building was a classic representation of 1950s American industrial might. The dark green thermopanel glass that sheathed the 38 stories of the Secretariat building sparkled like a giant polished jade pillar against the blue sky. After checking in at the main entrance, their guide led them into building DC-1 and up to the 4th floor, the home of most UN training and international workshops. Behind the reception desk, a display board listed the programs for the day. Zoe was proud to spot their name on the board. Qingshan Nuclear Power Plant Delegation, China, Nuclear Safety Training and Protocols. In room 407, notes and sketches from what looked like a science and agricultural workshop covered the whiteboard. Minister Shin tapped Zoe's shoulder nervously. "Are you sure this is our room?" "This is where the receptionist told us to come, and the directory board had our delegation's name on it," she reassured him, but she looked at her watch nonetheless. 5 minutes past 10 o'clock. Why wasn't anyone there to meet them? She turned back to the door to check the room number again and nearly bumped into a man carrying a black leather briefcase. "Sorry," they both said at the same time, and shared an apologetic laugh. Zoe broke off, stupefied. He looked to be in his late 50s, attractive, with dark brown hair scattered with a few silver strands. He had a few wrinkles and a medium-fit build, but what struck Zoe was his face. The blue eyes, full of intelligence and humor, tempered with gentleness. The straight nose, sculpted chin, and sensual lips she had kissed so many times. Surely it can't be him, Zoe thought, and she dropped her eyes to the name tag on his chest. He smiled, a bit embarrassed by her sudden and intense scrutiny. So sorry to be late. I know Chinese people like to be on time for their appointments. The familiar voice, warm and steady, left her stunned. She could neither think nor speak, only stare at him in utter disbelief. Her eyes opened wide as conflicting emotions surged through her body. Oh my God, it is! It's John! It's him! Seeing the foreigner's discomfort at Zoe's lack of response, Minister Shin pushed forward to relieve the awkwardness and introduce himself. In broken English, he said, "I'm Minister Shin, head of China's Nuclear Science and Technology Delegation. Oh, welcome to New York and the United Nations. John Thompson, IAEA's Department of Technical Cooperation." John shook Minister Shin's hand and then offered his hand to Zoe. "John Thompson, welcome." Zoe's heart pounded wildly, and her hand felt clammy in John's warm palm. She managed to get the words out in her fluent English. "Zhu Yimeng, nuclear scientist and interpreter for the delegation." John gazed at her for a moment, still holding on to her hand, and repeated her name slowly but carefully. "Zhu Yi. Zoe." "Zhu Yi," she said politely, pulling her hand away. "My English name doesn't matter anymore," she thought. "It'll be less troublesome that way." She turned to Minister Shin, clearing her throat. "Mr. Thompson is here to represent the IAEA for our inquiry. Are we ready to begin?" While Minister Shin gave his opening remarks, she crossed to the other side of the whiteboard. She could feel John's eyes following her, but she had gotten her emotions under control now. Her voice was steady and neutral as she translated Minister Shin's words, although she avoided looking directly at John. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for meeting with us. As you know, we have a lot of information to cover in only 3 days. Our goal for this meeting is to gain your expert advice on China's nuclear program, particularly on the efficacy of our power station design. According to our schedule, today we plan to primarily discuss the Chernobyl disaster, so that everyone in our delegation will have a thorough understanding of how and why it happened, and its consequences as well. This knowledge will help us address potential problems with our own projects, both for Qingshan plant and future designs." As she finished speaking, her eyes met his for a brief moment. She allowed a small smile and nod before she dropped her gaze. John's look lingered for a moment longer, and then his official persona took over, and he greeted the rest of the delegation. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UN in New York. It's my pleasure to be here with you for the next 3 days, discussing various issues relating to nuclear safety standards for material management, installation, operation, and emergency procedures. Over the last year, the IAEA has thoroughly investigated, in conjunction with Russian experts, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. We have developed and implemented some international safety standards for the nuclear industry. The purpose of this workshop is to familiarize your delegation with these standards so you can implement them in your plants for improved safety." He stopped, suddenly realizing he might have said too much to translate all at once, and looked apologetically at Zoe. She responded with a pleasant smile and launched into her Chinese translation. As she spoke, he lost himself in her face. The smile he had never forgotten, the woman he had loved and treasured for nearly 4 decades. It was Zoe, his heart told him, but he was afraid to believe it. She was slightly taller than he remembered, but still well-proportioned. Her silky black hair, brushed back in a soft wave, complemented both her personality and her simultaneously elegant but business-like appearance. Time had added some wrinkles, but could not diminish her beauty and grace. Her voice was still soft and melodious, although he could not understand the Chinese words. His heart thumped with excitement, and he longed to wrap his arms around her, look deep in her eyes, and call her by her name, Zoe. He gazed fixedly at her, lost in his own reunion fantasy, until she interjected, "Mr. Thompson, I've finished." He snapped back to reality, startled by how far away his thoughts had drifted. Thank you," he said, covering his embarrassment by turning to load slides into the projector. The photos of the ruined Chernobyl nuclear plant station brought gasps of surprise and shock from the Chinese experts. Most of them had never seen the full extent of the explosion's aftermath. John waited until the reactions died down. "You may or may not have seen some of these pictures already. Regardless, I will go through the events to make sure everyone understands precisely what occurred to bring about the reactor's failure. The Chernobyl reactor used graphite, and with this moderator, the temperature rises slowly under fault conditions. What that means is that by the time the reactor malfunction is detected, it may be too late to fix the problem." He paused for Zoe's translation, and then continued. On 25 April 1986, Chernobyl's reactor number 4 was due to be shut down for maintenance. During the shutdown, a decision was made to test one of the generators. The power output of the reactor was reduced slowly over a 12-hour period, but a power surge caused a rupture in the pipes that carried water through the core. Without this critical water, the temperature continued to climb despite the reduced power output. As I noted, this type of reactor does not efficiently detect a rise in temperature. When the operators noticed the increase in temperature, they knew the problem was already serious, and they panicked. To lower the temperature, operators opened the safety systems and dumped water into the overheated core. The effect was virtually instantaneous conversion of the water into high-pressure steam, causing an enormous explosion that ripped the reactor apart and released a huge amount of deadly radiation. A few days after the incident, the reactor was entombed under a thick layer of sand and concrete to prevent the release of additional radiation into the atmosphere. But the reactor core, made up of 40,000 enriched uranium fuel rods, was still burning underneath. The ensuing meltdown could potentially burn its way deep into the earth and contaminate the water supply for decades. John stopped again, sweeping his gaze around the rapt audience. However, being a dictatorial regime, the communist Russian government tried to cover up and later minimize the incident. This attitude does not help the world in reducing the damage from such disasters or in addressing the risks they present to the global community. He could feel the tension in the room intensify at the words dictatorial regime and communist. He turned to Zoe to gauge her reaction. She seemed calm and comfortable with translating, and that somehow seemed to alleviate some of his unease. To prevent the so-called China syndrome, where the core theoretically melts through the planet all the way to China, workers risked their lives to tunnel underneath the crippled plant and pour a thick layer of cement and boron beneath the burning reactor. At the same time, a cooling system had to be installed inside the tomb to keep the core from heating up again and causing another explosion. It will take many years before the Chernobyl cleanup is complete. First, a continual flood of water over the site is required to absorb the radiation. Second, remote-controlled robots continuously survey the scene of the accident and assist with some of the cleanup tasks. Finally, workers will be sent in under strict safety guidelines to complete the cleanup and dismantle the reactor.